I'd like to welcome you back to the School of the Prophets. We're going to be continuing in our study here in our next lesson, which is lesson number 5. This lesson is called Gideon. We're going to be looking at a lot of the parallels between the story of Joseph, who was sold into Egypt by his brothers, and the story of Gideon, and also looking at some of these parallels in future times. If you haven't read recently these stories, I recommend before you continue this video to go back and refresh your memory on these stories. The story of Joseph can be found in Genesis. We're going to be basically touching on chapters 41 through 48 for the most part. And the story of Gideon can be found in Judges chapters 6 through 8. And we're going to be looking at other passages that can correlate with these. And so if you haven't read these stories, like I said, I recommend you go back and just refresh your mind before you continue watching this video. I'd like to start out reading a couple passages that will kind of give us the layout of where we're going. The first one I want to read is in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 25 through 29. And it reads like this. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world, and things which are despised, hath God chosen. Yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. And really what God is laying out here is that oftentimes he chooses the smallest, he chooses the weakest, he chooses the person that we would probably not choose as humans, because he wants the world to know it's him, God, who's doing it. It's not the strength of the man, it's not the wisdom of the man, it's not the capabilities of the man. Well, all those things are important in the end. God wants us to know that it's him working through that man that made it all possible. And that's why the wisdom of God seems foolishness to men. Because if we were going to look for someone to do a job, we would look for the best professional we could find. But from God's perspective, the best we have is nothing compared to his abilities. And so he chooses that which has no ability, and then he can show that person exactly what to do, and it can be perfect. As perfect as it can be for us as humans to do, because it was God who did it. It wasn't the man himself. And that's what we're going to see in some of these stories. And as you read the Old Testament, you'll find that actually very frequently God chooses the weakest and the smallest and the least likely candidates to do his work. The next passage I'd like to read is in 2 Nephi chapter 2, verses 44 through 48. And it says, And now behold, my son Joseph, after this manner did my father of old prophesy. Wherefore, because of this covenant, thou art blessed. For thy seed shall not be destroyed, and they shall hearken unto the words of the book, and there shall rise up one mighty among them, which shall do much good both in work and in deed, being an instrument in the hands of God, with exceeding faith, to work mighty wonders, and do that thing which is great in the sight of God, unto the bringing to pass much restoration of the house of Israel, and unto the seed of thy brethren. And now blessed art thou, Joseph. For those who believe in the Book of Mormon, we know that this is a promise given by Lehi to his youngest son, Joseph. And this promise was that his descendants wouldn't be destroyed. When the immigrants came to the Americas, the Spanish and the English and the French and all the people who migrated to the United States, out of all of the indigenous people who would be slaughtered, there would remain of this family of Joseph some genetic. And that one day out of this genetic would come forth a man who's going to do a great mighty work here in the Americas, most likely. We know through the reading of the Book of Mormon that Lehi read through the plates that they brought with them and found that he was from the genetic family tree of Joseph, more specifically from the line of Manasseh. And that's what we're going to concentrate more than anything on in this study, is the line of Manasseh, because that's the promises that we want to look at as we're looking at the types and shadows in this study. The next passage I'd like to read is in Ether in the Book of Mormon, chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. And it says, "And that a new Jerusalem should be built up upon this land, unto the remnant of the seed of Joseph, for the which thing there has been a type. For as Joseph brought his father down into the land of Egypt, even so he died there. Wherefore the Lord brought a remnant of the seed of Joseph out of the land of Jerusalem, that he might be merciful unto the seed of Joseph, that they should not perish. Even as he was merciful unto the father of Joseph, that he should not perish. Wherefore the remnant of the house of Joseph shall be built upon this land, and it shall be a land of their inheritance, and they shall build up a holy city unto the Lord, like unto the Jerusalem of old, and they shall no more be confounded until the end come, when the earth shall pass away." And here we have another promise that's just extraordinary, in that through the line of Lehi here in the Americas, through those who came and immigrated here with him, one day they would build up a group of believers in the end time, in the coming of the Lord. They would build up a group of believers that would be ready for the Lord's return. And it's just an extraordinary promise that we look for the fulfilling of, and we strive and work in our own lives so we can be a part of that fulfilling. But again, this is a promise coming through the line of Joseph, through the line of Manasseh, inevitably. And that's part of that promise that was given to Joseph of Egypt. When you go back all the way into the promises that were given to Joseph of Egypt, he was promised that he would have 2 inheritances. And that's not just speaking of Ephraim and Manasseh, but literally that's speaking of the promise of his part in the old world, in the Middle East, in Israel, and his part here in the new world. Because this is where Manasseh came through Lehi and established another people here. One of the reasons why this is so important as we're going through it is the very dreams that Joseph himself had. And I'd like to go back and just refresh specifically reading in those dreams, because I think that there's some points in those dreams that can help us understand why the types, as it said here, there was already a type given, and that type given was that Joseph was able to save his family. And that's the promise again in the end, that Joseph will again save his family. How he'll do it, I can't say, but that's the promise that God has given us. And so I'd like to go back and just read the two dreams that really got Joseph in trouble with his brothers and his family, and made his brothers angry with him, and inevitably we can say kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back, and caused his brothers to begin to plot to sell him into slavery. And this is back in Genesis chapter 37. We're going to read these 2 dreams. We'll read the first one, and then we'll read the second one. And we know that Joseph, as a young boy, had these dreams and came out and shared them with his family. And but let's go ahead and read them. Genesis chapter 37, and we'll start in verse 3. "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him yet more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brother said unto him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. That's our first dream. And what we're really seeing here is, of course, we know they were an agricultural people, and they're out cutting the wheat or the barley, one of the two, and they're binding it up in sheaves, which is a bundle of the stalks of grass that are the barley or the wheat, and they're bundling them together in their harvest and stacking them up in these bundles. And Joseph puts his bundle in a spot, and his brothers put their bundles around his, and each one of their sheaves inevitably just bows right over. Each one of these sheaves is probably right around 2 to 3 feet tall, more or less, and they're doubling in the middle, and as if they were bowing, as if they were going before a king and bowing. And in this first dream, we're only seeing Joseph's brothers bowing to him. And of course, as we read the story, we know that when Joseph was sold into Egypt, eventually he came to rule underneath the Pharaoh, second in command in all of Egypt. And we know that there was a famine. We know his brothers showed up, and we know that this was fulfilled. All of his brothers came and bowed before him. And we know that this part of the dream, this dream here, actually had its fulfillment right there in Joseph's own life. But now we have a second dream that comes into play. And oftentimes we put the two dreams together and think that they're one and the same. But there's just a small difference, and that's important to know. This is the second dream, starting in verse 9. And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves unto thee? And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. And that's the important dream, more than anything, for what we're going to be going through today, because in the second dream, you see not only all of his brothers bowing to him, but another mystery. Both his father and his mother bowed to him. Now, as we go through the story of Joseph, if you've read through it and refresh your memory, you'll know that when Joseph's father and his families all moved to Egypt and start living in Egypt, his mother's already dead. His mother, technically, physically, never bowed to him. She never observed the fact that he was second in command in Egypt. And so a literal fulfillment of what we're seeing here didn't happen in Joseph's time. And that's where these prophecies in the Book of Mormon come into play, that there was a type. And this type was in the life of Joseph. What was going to happen? Joseph was separated from his family, separated from his brethren, but a day would come when because of him, his brethren would receive salvation. His brethren would be saved once more, including all the way back to his mother and father, the whole family. And that's what we're looking for, the second piece of this dream. The first piece we know happened. Now we're looking for the fulfillment of the second piece of this dream. But as we're looking through this dream, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, well, how will it happen? And of course, that's one of the reasons we've done a lot of our studies, is because the scripture shows us that there's actually patterns. And we want to look at one of these patterns and kind of project it forward to our time and try to see how it could be fulfilled in our own time, in our own lives. And when we're looking at the story of Joseph and the story of Gideon, we see two parallels. Now when we go back and we look at Gideon, we find out that Gideon came out of the family of Joseph, specifically out of the family of Manasseh, and we're going to look at that. And we can see that many things that happened in Gideon's life were paralleled in Joseph's life himself. And so it gives us a second witness, a second parallel for the potential of what could happen in our own time frame. And so one of the first things we're going to look at, if you have the booklet, I'm just going to kind of basically read through and jump through the chart that I have laid out there. As you can see in the third line, today in prophecy, not all of the boxes are filled in, and not all of the parallels are probably here in this chart, but it's just to kind of get our feet wet and get us thinking about how this could happen. And as we can see in the first line, we have Joseph of Egypt. The second line, Gideon and what happened in his life. And then, as I said, the third line, today in prophecy. And in the first line, under Joseph, when we're looking at this, it says, one of Jacob's youngest son, yet most beloved of Jacob. Joseph's son were Ephraim and Manasseh. Kind of gives us a layout of who it is we're talking about. And again, as we read, earlier on in 1 Corinthians, God chooses the smallest, the weakest. Now we know that Joseph wasn't the youngest son, but he was one of the youngest sons. And he was least liked among his brethren. And so he wasn't the choice person to have this kind of a blessing. And when we look into Judges and we look at Gideon, of course we find in Judges 6:15, it says, "My family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's household." And Gideon's referring to himself, who he is. And he's looking very similar to Joseph. He's the least liked, he's the smallest in the family, and he's coming out of the line of Joseph through Manasseh. And then I have a passage here in Amos chapter 8, verse 3, and it says, "And Aminadai was a descendant of Nephi, who was the son of Lehi, who came out of the land of Jerusalem, who was a descendant of Manasseh, who was the son of Joseph, which was sold into Egypt by the hands of his brethren." And of course the point here to bring this verse is to bring through the parallel. This is all coming through Manasseh. That's who we're focusing on. And we have this group, just a small group, and probably not the best, as we know when we read the beginning of the Book of Mormon. Half of Lehi's family, Laman and Lemuel, didn't really want to leave Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem was about to be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave their riches, their home, their nice lives. And so we have a division right down the middle of Lehi's family, half of them really rebelling against God. And as we read the story, we can see that rebellion grew very large and split their whole culture into what were oftentimes termed the Lamanites and the Nephites. The Nephites, generally speaking, being the people who served God, and the Lamanites, generally speaking, being the ones who were rebellious and didn't serve God. And so we have, probably not the best coming out, but Lehi was willing to listen, and that's why God chose him. And just like Gideon here, Gideon was willing to listen. The angel came to him and told him, "God has chosen you." Gideon was doubtful, and oftentimes when a person who, like it says here, is the weakest or the smallest, and God comes and points to them and says, "I'm choosing you," it's real easy to be doubtful, because you look around yourself and say, there's so many more people, more capable, better capable than I to do this work. And that's probably, where Lehi falls in, that's where Gideon falls in, that's where Joseph falls in. Each one of these, God chose it because God could use them. God could be the one who would get the glory and the honor out of it, not the person. And that's really important. In our second line here, of course, we have Genesis 41:27. "And the 7 thin and ill-favored kind that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears, blasted with the east wind, shall be 7 years of famine." And of course, we know in the story of Joseph, we have these years of famine, these years of problem and tribulation that brought about part of our story. And without that famine, Joseph may not have risen to the position he was, because he wouldn't have translated, he wouldn't have interpreted through the power of God the Pharaoh's dream. And so they wouldn't have been able to prepare for the famine, and a whole part of the story would have been missing. But here we have Joseph, and because of the Pharaoh's dream, he was able to rise into his position of power by the help of God. And when we look at the story of Gideon, of course, we have the same thing. The Israelites are stuck in this problem. They're surrounded by Midianites, and every time they plant, the Midianites come in and wipe out their harvest. There's no food, there's famine, the people are crying out to God, the people are wanting a Savior. And God comes and speaks to Gideon. And as I have listed here in Judges 6:1 and also 4, Israel was 7 years in captivity under the Midianites, which caused a famine in the land. And we saw that play out in the story of Gideon. Same 7, both times, 7 years of trouble. And could that play out today somehow in the way Joseph is going to save his family again? Very likely. Does it have to? No, not really. But there's a potential parallel there. I will go on, Genesis 42, verse 2. "And he, Jacob, said, Behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt." And so through the famine, we have what was prophesied in the Book of Mormon, the saving of Joseph's father. Joseph's father hears there's corn in Egypt. Why? Because his own son was guided by God to prepare and get ready for what was just about to happen. And of course, in Judges 6:6, we know that the people were also calling out to God and asking for a Savior. And that's when God sent the angel to speak to Gideon. And of course, the parallel to that would be today, as the world is crumbling and falling apart, and fear is on the rise. We could almost expect, doesn't have to be this way, but we could almost expect that there would be a people of God who God would touch and speak to and put on their hearts to prepare, to get ready for what's coming. And neither Joseph nor Gideon knew what was around the bend, and we may not know perfectly what the future holds today, but the point was God called them to get ready. And that's our parallel here. And we have Genesis 41:12. And there was with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And so if we remember the story of Joseph, he was working in Potiphar's house for a time, and Potiphar's wife tries to tempt him, tries to cause him to sin. Joseph doesn't. He runs, and Potiphar's wife screams out. Eventually, Potiphar believes his wife more than Joseph and puts Joseph in prison, and now he's captive. And how's he going to get out? But that's all part of the plan of God. In the same prison cell is the cupbearer to the Pharaoh and also the baker. They both have dreams, which had to happen that way because it was through a dream that Joseph was going to come out of prison. And so God prepared him, gave him understanding in this dream, probably because of his own dreams and watching how some of his first dreams took place in his own life. Now he's able to look at, through the guidance of God and through the Holy Spirit, look at the dreams of the cupbearer and also the baker, and God gives him understanding. He shares that understanding with the cupbearer and the baker, and when they leave, of course, one of them dies. The other one goes back to his job, serving the king, and now there's a witness. There's someone else who can prepare and announce the way. Of course, we know there was a time that the cupbearer forgot entirely about Joseph, but when the Pharaoh dreamed, there was that moment. And he was able to step forward and say, wait a minute, there's a guy back in the prison cell that I was in who could interpret dreams. And that gave the opening for Joseph to come out. And again, just God's hand moving. And of course, in Gideon's case, just before Gideon comes out, we have in Judges 6:8, we have another prophet, not Gideon, but another prophet who comes in and begins prophesying to the people, begins preparing the people for the potential that's about to happen. And if we look in 1 Nephi chapter 3, verses 183 through 191, and I'm not going to read them all, just going to read a piece of them. It says, I beheld other books which came forth by the power of the Lamb. And so God sent forth other books. Of course, the Book of Mormon is one of those. And it comes forward and it gives us understanding of prophecies for this land. Many of the prophecies in the Bible are about the Middle East, Israel, and what's going to happen there. The Book of Mormon gives us specific prophecies about the Americas and what's going to happen here. And so it begins to be our first witness, like that prophet that came before Gideon, or like the cupbearer that was able to announce to the Pharaoh that there was someone who could interpret dreams, who was Joseph. And so we have this other witness telling us these are the things that are going to happen, so that we can prepare ourselves and get our hearts ready, and get our minds and our spirits ready. Then we go on to Genesis chapter 48, verses 4 through 22. And I will give this land to the seed of, to thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession. Moreover, I have given to thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite, with my sword and with my bow. And of course, this is a prophecy of the promised land in the Middle East, Israel's land over there, how it was going to be divided up into 12 tribes. And this particular promise is to Joseph. He's getting a second portion above his brothers. And of course, we know over there in the Middle East, as they broke up the land, there were two portions. There was a portion for Manasseh and there was a portion for Ephraim. But more specifically, this prophecy is that Joseph will have one portion above his brothers. And that was here in the Americas. And that was important. But Joseph was the least, But this is the promise that God's giving him. God's doing this, no one else. And in Gideon, in the story of Gideon in Judges 6:9, we have that there were other nations being expelled and kicked out, just like we saw there in Genesis. Other nations, the Amorites and others, kicked out so that God's people could possess it. And that's the pattern. And we can see that that's a pattern that could continue. We have in Ether, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "And now I, Moroni, proceed to give an account of those ancient inhabitants which were destroyed by the hand of the Lord upon the face of this north country." And so the prophecy was that there was a group of people here. They were destroyed off in preparation for another people to come. And that's kind of the way God's worked. And so we can kind of see that there could be something there. And maybe we don't understand it all, whether it's a physical or whether it's spiritual, but one day God's people will rise up and fall into their inheritance, their promised land. We can see in the story of Gideon, of course, and as we get into our studies on the feasts of Israel, we'll see that there could be some other potential in this. But in the story of Gideon, everything is beginning to take place in Gideon's time during the wheat harvest. And we get that out of Judges 6:11. And the wheat harvest is very important. And we'll go on. In Genesis 37:5 says, "And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brethren, and they hated him yet more." And of course, that's part of the story in Joseph. His own family despised him. They didn't want anything to do with him, and of course we know they sold him into slavery and got rid of him. And there's something there. And of course Gideon said the same thing. "I'm the least liked out of my family." And it had to take, as I have listed here in Judges 6:12, "An angel came to bring witness to deliverance." It was unlikely Gideon was just going to assume that he was the kind of guy that was going to save his people. He was the least liked, like Joseph was the least liked. And that's important, though, because that's what God was wanting to use. And we have Joseph Smith's second experience that he had, and just a piece of it. It says, "And he said that he was a messenger sent from the presence of God to me, and that God had a work for me to do." And of course we know Joseph Smith wasn't a perfect person, even as a young man before he came into the things of God, but he was the one God chose, and he did do a mighty work. And God, through him, was able to bring about the restoration of the truth and his people, his church, and also the authority, the ability to have callings, the ability to do laying on of hands for baptism and for the reception of the Holy Spirit. The authority that was lost for quite some time, as we have in the book of Revelations, and it talks about that the woman that was seen in Revelations with the moon below her feet and bathed in the sun, with a crown of stars on her head, 12 stars. And it says at one point she had a child, and that child was taken up to heaven, which of course we know right after Christ's death and resurrection, the church existed for a very brief period of time until Rome came in and destroyed Jerusalem. And we have the dispersion of the church, and shortly the absolute destruction of all believers as they were hunted down and killed, and the authority of the church, the ministry, taken away. And what was left in religion at that time was a broken religion without authority. God took that child up to heaven, which was the power and authority of the church. We'll continue on, Genesis 37, verses 8 and 9. Of course, it says, "Thou shalt indeed reign over us, and behold, the sun and the moon and the stars made obeisance to me." And so Joseph was going to be called and set aside above his brothers spiritually, in a way that they would look to him. And of course we have the same in the story of Gideon. He's called and set apart, even though he's the least likely, he's called and set apart. And in 2 Nephi chapter 2, verse 46, it says, "And there shall rise up one mighty among them, which shall do much good, both in word and in deed." And through that prophecy in the Book of Mormon, we know that in these last days there was going to be one who God would call up, mighty and strong, not necessarily in the physical sense of the world, but it could mean that also, but more than anything, speaking spiritually. Like Joseph, mighty and strong, willing to deny himself what Potiphar's wife offered, willing to deny himself the thrills of the life to dedicate himself to God and believing and following and obeying the commandments. Genesis 41:38 through 41, just a piece of it. See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And that was the promise that Pharaoh gave to Joseph. He was set over everything. He was raised up to a position of power that only God himself could do. It was an unlikely thing because Joseph wasn't Egyptian. He was a foreigner who was now supreme power, aside from the Pharaoh himself. Only in the Pharaoh being able to stop whatever Joseph might want to do, only in that one power was Joseph not all powerful in all of Egypt. And so we have a huge raising up here. And we have something similar happening in Gideon's story. Of course, first off, he does his test of the fleece because he wants self-assurance. And when they actually go to battle, God comes to him and tells him, take your servant, go down, listen to the enemy's camp. And he goes down to the enemy's camp, and someone in the enemy's camp has a dream. And they explain that dream about a large loaf of bread rolling into camp and smashing a tent. And one of the other soldiers there says, well, that can be nothing less than Gideon. What an extraordinary thought, that the enemy is already looking at Gideon as their greatest foe. The least likely candidate is now all of a sudden the biggest worry for the enemy. And so we see through the power of God and God alone, Gideon gets the reassurance that he is the tool that God's going to use. And we have in Daniel chapter 2 verse 44, and in the days of these kings shall God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. A promise in the book of Daniel that one day when the statue of Nebuchadnezzar was complete in all of its part, from the head to the toes, every one of these nations sovereign, every one of these nations in the world at the same time, God would come into the world and raise up a small nation, his people, and they would never again be destroyed. They would always be here till the end. And that promise, of course, was fulfilled on April 6, 1830, in a very brief period of time when every one of the parts of the statue of Nebuchadnezzar was here in the world and sovereign in their own power. Genesis 39:2, and the Lord was with Joseph. And we know that that's the most important thing. God was with Joseph. And, of course, we find the same in Judges. When God accepts Gideon's offering, he brings out the offering. When the angel calls him, he tells the angel, if you are truly an angel from God, wait here a moment that I might bring you food. And he runs into his house, he prepares a meal, brings it out. The angel says, put it on the rock, dump the broth out on the ground, and the angel touches it with a staff, and poof, it all goes up in flames, an offering acceptable to God. And God is with Gideon. And we know that's the promise in these last days also. God will be with his people. And he will show those signs and wonders that give us confidence that God is with us. Genesis 41:48, and he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt. And we know that Joseph goes and he collects up all the good that he can during the good years, during the blessing, so that they can bless the bad years. And we know that at the same time, Gideon does something very similar. God tells him to take one of his father's bullocks, take it and tear down the evil idols, tear down the idols to false gods, build up a real idol to the real God, and do a sacrifice. And he does that sacrifice, and God accepts what he does. 1 Nephi 3:204 to 205. They shall no more be brought down into captivity, and the house of Israel shall no more be confounded. The promise for these last days, that there would come a moment when God's people, they wouldn't run around in darkness any longer. They wouldn't run around in confusion, but there would come this moment when they would have understanding. Not only would they have understanding, but confidence in their God. Genesis 41:57. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was sore in all the lands. And so you have all the people around coming in, and we know Joseph's family also came in and was saved because God used Joseph, that blessing. And part of this relates back to his coat of many colors that his father gave him. And part of that relates forward to our time, in that the parallel, the type is that Joseph will save them all over again. And we know that part of that saving was when God restored the Book of Mormon, the truth, because it cleared the murky water about what truth is. And when we go back just to the Bible, just to the Book of Mormon, and set aside all of our own personal opinions, suddenly things become clear. Suddenly the way opens up, and we know that there is a truth, an absolute truth. And that's really what God was doing here. Of course, in Gideon's story, as I said, he removes all the idols, he gets rid of all the confusion, and sets an open door, an open path before the people. And in 1 Nephi 3, verses 2:32, and it came to pass that I beheld that the wrath of God was poured out upon the great and abominable church. That moment when the idols of this world again are destroyed, and that which is wicked and evil is wiped away, and a perfect, true, pure thing is set before the people. Choice. They can walk in the way of God. Genesis 42:3, and Joseph's 10 brethren went down to buy corn in Egypt. And we know that in the story, of course, originally when Joseph's brothers come down, only 10 of them come. The youngest is left back. Benjamin is left. And so this is Joseph's only brother. And his father is just clinging to him as he would have clinged to Joseph. But interesting, only 10 come down. And when Gideon goes out and begins to tear down the idols and prepare the way for the saving of Israel, in Judges 6:27, we know that 10 of his servants go out with him. 10 men plus Gideon, 10 of his brothers plus Joseph, and they prepare the way for salvation. They prepare the way to open the doors. And there could be a parallel there. In Judges 6:3, we have the Midianites and the Amalekites are against Israel. We have the people, their neighbors who are around them, are against them and want to destroy them. And we have, of course, in Joseph's time, there was famine all around, destruction, and Joseph was about to save the people, just as Gideon is about to save the people. And we can parallel that to today's world that we live in. There is terror all around. There are problems, natural disasters, wars, rumors of wars, terrorists, you name it. And it's a prime time, just like the times that we're looking at in Joseph's time and in Gideon's time. And all that's left is that the people rise up and call out to their God. In Judges, of course, Gideon calls together some of the tribes. He sent out messengers through Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. The beginning of the saving in Israel in this time begins with a small group. Not all of the tribes, just some of them. And of course, if we go into the Book of Mormon and the Book of Jacob, chapter 3, verses 127, 60, 65, 67, and 68, we see that there are originally there's one original tree and 4 branches of the olive tree. So it says that they're grafting in the branches, beginning at the last, that they can be first, and the first that they can be last. And let's go ahead and read in Jacob. We're going to read in chapter 3. We're going to read verses 60, 65, 67, 68, where it talks about each one of these branches. And it says in verse 60, and he beheld the first, that it had brought forth much fruit, and he beheld also that it was good. So there's your first tree. In verse 65, and it came to pass that the Lord of the vineyard saith unto his servant, look hither, behold, I have planted another branch of the tree also, and thou knowest that this spot of ground was poorer than the first. There you have your second tree. And then in verse 67, and it came to pass that the Lord of the vineyard saith again to his servant, look hither, and behold another branch also, which I have planted. Behold, I have nourished it also, and it hath brought forth fruit. The third tree. And now in verse 68, and he saith unto the servant, look hither, and behold the last. Behold, this have I planted in a good spot of ground, and I have nourished it this long time. And only a part of the tree hath brought forth tame fruit, and the other part of the tree hath brought forth wild fruit. Behold, I have nourished this tree like unto all the others. And so we have these 4 trees plus the original tree, a total of 5 trees. Just like in the time of Gideon, he calls in the 4 tribes, and of course there's Gideon and his household, which are actually leading the battle here. And so you have this parallel. Next, in Judges 7, verses 2 through 7, we can see that we have a mass of people coming in out of these small tribes that want to help Gideon. And God says they're too many. And he separates out a bunch of them. And they go home. And yet there's still too many, God says. And so they all kneel down in front of the water, and they're drinking water. And God says, there's certain of these that are drinking water a certain way. Select out these. And it ends up being just a finite group of people compared to the original quantity. 300 men, nothing more. A very small group. And these are the men that are going to march with Gideon into the battle and be the means that God uses to save Israel. And we can compare that to our time today in 1 Nephi 3, 2:26. And it says, and I beheld the church of the Lamb of God, and its numbers were few. And of course we know in these last days when the church was restored, there was a huge influx of people in the beginning of the restoration of the church, coming from all over the world. But in very short time, many of those people were gone out of the true church of Christ. The church divided, and a huge group went off and started their own church, and then those churches divided up, and there's all kinds of small splinter groups that have divided up, but the true church of Christ is still there, only now its numbers are quite a bit more smaller than they were. And so we can see this all playing out all over again. And God came to the people, we see in the next line in Judges 7, 8, and the only thing he commanded the people to bring through Gideon was that they were to bring their food and to bring the trumpets. Bring that was necessary. And of course we relate that today. The most important thing today is the spiritual food, that we're constantly spiritually feeding ourselves, and the trumpets are the announcing of Christ, because everything points to him. He is our everything. He is our all, Christ. And so that's the trumpets. We're constantly announcing Christ. And that's what's important right now for our time. And now we go to Genesis 46, 2 through 4. And it says, and God spake unto Israel in a vision of the night, fear not to go down into Egypt. I will also surely bring thee up again. And so we have this prophecy coming to Joseph's father when he needed it most, this vision that he could safely go up to Egypt, and God would preserve him. God would preserve his children and his people and all that he needed to do, that he needn't have fear. And we have, of course, the other part to this in Gideon's life, when he was down at the enemy's camp and he heard the enemy's vision and he heard the enemy's interpretation of the same vision, it gave him confidence to do what he knew he needed to do. Even though he was the least, even though he probably wasn't the greatest choice for captain in the terms of human sense, God gave him the courage and the confidence he needed to fulfill the task ahead of us. And when we go on back to Genesis 45, verses 4 and verses 5 and verses 6, it says, God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land. And yet there are 5 years. And we have this other parallel where Joseph is explaining to his brothers that there's a certain amount of time that God set him aside to prepare for what was about to happen. And when we look at that time period, prophetically speaking, 2 years out of 7, because it was going to be 7 years of famine, is almost exactly equivalent to the beginning of the middle watch in time. And what I mean by that is in Israel they had 4 watches. 3 watches, I'm sorry. 3 watches. Each watch is 4 hours. And so you have a split up of time that is calculated by a 12-hour period. And each one of those 12-hour period, or that 12-hour period is split into 3 pieces. And so the beginning of that middle watch is almost identical to 2 out of 7 years, which is interesting because if we go also to Judges 7:19, it says, salvation comes at the beginning of the middle watch. At the middle watch, they went in and salvation came to Israel. And so you have almost a complete parallel in this time. And Jesus gives us another piece to this parallel, speaking of these last days in the book of Luke 12:38, when he says, and if he shall come in the second watch, or come in the third watch, explaining that there were 3 watches, and that Jesus might come in the second, or he might come in the third. And that gives us understanding. Of course, in Gideon's, he came at the beginning of the middle watch. That would have been the beginning of the second watch. And that's when salvation came for the house of Joseph, basically, in the beginning of what would be the middle watch. And Jesus promises that he may come in the second watch, or he may come in the third watch. We don't really know. But we have these parallels coming across time. Back to Genesis chapter 46:7, it says, and his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought he with him into Egypt. And when we jump into Judges to 7, chapter 7:24 and 8:1, we understand that in the beginning of the salvation of Israel in Gideon's time, only 4 of the tribes were involved in it. And actually, out of those 4 tribes, a very small number, 300, went with Gideon. And it wasn't until actually salvation had basically been given into their hands that now everyone's invited to participate. And if we go on to 3 Nephi chapter 10, verse 2, when it talks about these end days for us and things that began in the house of Joseph and Manasseh in the Americas, it says, and also as many of the house of Israel as shall come, giving us to understand that the beginning of this salvation in the end days was not, it didn't involve all of the tribes. Not that it couldn't have, but it didn't. And so we see this parallel coming down, but at the very end, they all come together. And it's all one big happy family. Of course, we have in Judges 8, 5, and 9, we actually have some groups that were inhibiting, preventing Gideon's success if they could prevent it, which they couldn't because God was involved in it, but they thought they might be able to help prevent it. The people of Sukkoth and Penuel, and I can't say how those can parallel, but there are groups out there today doing their best to prevent the truth from coming out. And of course, that's kind of ties into the parable of the wheat and the tares. And at that last day, the tares are gathered up, which tares are something that look a lot like wheat in a lot of ways. They're gathered up and they're thrown in the fire. Just like Gideon came back to these 2 groups and destroyed them because they were inhibiting the work of God. And lastly, Genesis 48:19, truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. When Joseph's father is blessing his children, he lays his hand not on the firstborn, Manasseh, but rather he lays his right hand on Ephraim's head, basically giving him the firstborn blessing. When Joseph sees this, he tries to untangle his father's hands. He says, no, father, the firstborn is actually this son. And his father says, yes, I understand that. And Manasseh will also be a great nation and be a very important part. But the firstborn blessing actually went to Ephraim. And of course, we parallel it into Gideon's time when they all came down and asked Gideon, okay, now that Israel's saved, you be the ruler over us. And Gideon said, no, that's not really my task. That's not really my position. I did what God gave me to do, and that's it. In the line of Manasseh was not the right for kingship. The right for kingship came through the line of Judah, not Manasseh. And so Gideon understood that while he was a tool in God's hands, the supreme part of this was not in his hands. He wasn't to take the kingship. And of course we have part of this blessing here that really Joseph through Manasseh in these last days is going to again offer to help his family and save his family. But inevitably, it all comes back to Jesus Christ, who came through the line of David and will sit supreme ruler. And he didn't come out of Manasseh's line. He came out of a different line. And he's really what the story is all about. And it's all coming down to him at these last days as he's pulling all the parts together and preparing for the permanent placement of his kingdom in this world. And a lot of people are against it, a lot of people are fighting it, but the promises are here, and the parallels are here, and we can see how the end of the story turns out. God reigns supreme, and that's what we're looking for, and that's what we're hoping for and striving for in all of our life. And I just want to thank you for your time, and I hope this study helps you. From here on out, all of our studies will begin in the feasts of Israel, and we're going to walk through each one of the feasts one by one and kind of see how Christ fulfilled them and the important things in them. And I hope you'll tune in.